What does a company on the edge of collapse actually build when it decides to go after the best sports sedan in the world? By name, in writing, in its own internal documents? Nissan's engineers, working under $20 billion of debt, opened a folder and wrote down the BMW 463 series, not as an aspiration, as a target. What came out of that decision was a 52-48 weight balance, a hydraulic steering rack, and a 6-speed manual inside a luxury sedan. The engine held a spot on Ward's 10 best list for 12 consecutive years. Every unit was assembled at the Tochigi plant, the same factory that builds the GTR, and almost no one who bought one in North America knew its real name. Every G35 sold here was a Skyline. Nissan just never said so. The crisis that built the car. To understand the soul of the G35, you have to look at how close Nissan came to disappearing from the automotive world entirely. By the late 1990s, the company wasn't just having a few bad months or a slow season. The situation was much more dire because debt had climbed past $20 billion and model lines were hemorrhaging cash every single day. Factories were sitting half empty with machines gone quiet, and by most accounts, the company was simply running out of time to save itself. Everything changed in 1999 when Renault bought a 36% stake in the company and sent Carlos Ghosn to Japan to take over as chief operating officer. Ghosn arrived with a strategy called the Nissan Revival Plan, which operated with a cold and brutal kind of logic. He cut supplier ties that had existed for decades, closed underperforming factories, and killed off every product line that couldn't prove it was making money. The mission wasn't about expansion or prestige, but about survival first and profit margins second. The plan worked faster than anyone expected, and Nissan was back in the black by the 2001 fiscal year. While the financial recovery made the headlines, the real story was what that newfound discipline allowed the engineers to do with the remaining budget. The revival plan forced a level of focus that the old, bloated version of Nissan never possessed. Instead of spreading money thin across dozens of mediocre projects, they now had concentrated capital to spend on one significant breakthrough. That focused investment funded a project that a struggling Nissan could never have dreamed of before the crisis. They built a clean sheet architecture known as the FM platform. The name stands for front midship, and it wasn't just a modified version of an old chassis or a shared parts bin special. The engineers designed it from the ground up as a rear-wheel drive layout, with the engine sitting entirely behind the front axle centerline. Making a car this way is incredibly expensive because it complicates the packaging of every other component, but the payoff is a center of gravity that front-heavy competitors can never achieve. Nissan developed this platform to support two cars at the same time, which allowed them to split the massive engineering costs. The Nissan 350Z and the G35 launched together in 2003, sharing the same bones and the same mechanical DNA. This shared development is the only reason the project was financially viable for a company that had just barely escaped bankruptcy. This financial context is the most important part of the car's history. The crisis that nearly killed Nissan is the exact reason the G35 was engineered with such intensity and purpose. The pressure of the debt forced a level of discipline that led to a superior platform, something a comfortable or lazy version of the company would have never bothered to build. At the Tochigi plant, right alongside the assembly line for the GTR, the G35 started to become a reality. It was a direct challenge to the greatest sports sedans in the world, built by a team that felt they had everything to prove and finally had the resources to do it right. The FM platform's name tells you exactly what it does, provided you know what you're looking for. Front midship. The engine sits not at the front of the car, in the conventional sense, but mid-positioned relative to the front axle. Every other front-engine rear-wheel drive car you can think of places the engine's mass forward of, or straddling that axle centerline. But the FM layout moves the entire block behind it, not partially, entirely. To achieve this, Nissan had to rethink the firewall. In a conventional layout, the firewall sits where the engine ends, but in the FM layout, the firewall moves rearward to accommodate an engine position that most front-engine architectures simply don't allow for. The long nose you see on the G35 is actually a small deception because that forward bodywork extends well ahead of the engine. There is more air in that nose than metal, as the engine sits much further back than the exterior shape suggests. The result of all that repositioning is a documented 52 to 48 weight distribution from front to rear. That number requires some context. The BMW E46 that Nissan was targeting achieved a true 50-50 split, which was one of the primary reasons that specific generation handled with such legendary balance. The G35 is front-heavy relative to that benchmark, yet it remains measurably and meaningfully better than what a conventional front-engine layout produces. In period instrumented testing, this was enough to make an impact. The G35 Sport package returned about 0.87 grams of lateral acceleration, which placed it ahead of the BMW 325i and kept it competitive with the more powerful 330i. Nissan didn't hide who they were measuring themselves against, and that is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. Period engineering communications and press materials from Nissan explicitly named the BMW E46 as the development benchmark. Specific competitor reference in official manufacturer documentation is unusual in the automotive industry because companies typically leave the competitive targeting implied. Nissan stated it directly, which tells you something about the confidence of the engineering team and the seriousness of their intent. The suspension geometry followed the same logic. Double wishbones were used at the front, with a multi-link independent setup at the rear, and the geometry of both was tuned specifically against the E46's specifications. The Sport package added revised spring rates, firmer damper calibration, and 18-inch wheels over the base car's 17-inch setup. Brembo 4-piston front calipers came standard on the Sport package rather than being offered as an optional upgrade. Then there is the factory where all of this was assembled. Nissan's Tochigi plant in Kaminakawa is not a general production facility. It is the birthplace of the GTR and the site where Z Series vehicles are meticulously assembled. When Nissan chose Tochigi for the G35, it was a deliberate decision to prioritize quality over volume. They could have used a higher capacity facility, but they chose the one with the performance manufacturing pedigree to communicate how the G35 was positioned internally. And then there is the detail that almost no American buyer ever knew. The G35 sold in North American showrooms from 2003 onward was mechanically identical to the Nissan Skyline 535, which had been on sale in Japan since 2001. Same platform, same engine, same factory. The Skyline name carries decades of performance history in Japan, yet it never appeared in a single piece of North American marketing. Nissan made the commercial decision that the Skyline name had no meaning to a buyer standing next to a BMW in an American showroom, so they left it off entirely. Every G35 sold in North America is a Skyline. Nissan just never said so. The engine that won 12 years running. The platform gave the G35 its balance, but the engine gave it a reason to exist. The VQ35DE is a 3.5-liter, naturally aspirated V6, featuring a 60-degree bank angle, an aluminum block, and 4 valves per cylinder. At launch in 2003, the sedan produced 260 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 260 pound-feet of torque. The coupe reached 287 horsepower thanks to revised intake manifold geometry. A mid-cycle revision for the 2005 and 2006 sedan eventually raised that figure to 280 horsepower through updated valve timing and intake calibration. Ward's 10 Best Engines. The VQ engine family appeared on that prestigious list every single year from 1995 through 2007, 12 consecutive years. Ward's evaluates engines annually against specific criteria like refinement and technical advancement, and these results are published and verifiable by year. 12 consecutive years is an unusual duration for any engine family to hold that recognition, and it stands as a historical fact rather than a marketing claim. What made the VQ35DE earn that recognition repeatedly isn't easy to reduce to a single specification. Part of the appeal is the broad torque curve that makes the engine feel useful well below its power peak. Part of that breadth comes from a feature most G35 owners never knew was sitting under the hood. The VQ35DE uses a variable intake manifold with a runner-length changeover valve. At lower RPM, the system routes the intake charge through longer runner paths to optimize resonance for torque delivery in the 2,000 to 4,500 RPM range. Above that point, the system opens a bypass that effectively shortens the runner path, shifting the resonance frequency to optimize airflow for high RPM power. The changeover is seamless and automatic, controlled entirely by the engine management system. Most owners felt the result without ever knowing the mechanism, as the engine simply felt willing at low speed and strong at high speed, with no obvious step between the two. Then there is the timing chain. The VQ35DE does not use a timing belt, but instead relies on a chain with hydraulic tensioners and plastic guide rails. There is no scheduled replacement interval because the chain is designed to last the life of the engine with correct maintenance. At high mileages, as the guide rails wear, chain slack increases and produces a cold start rattle that usually clears within seconds as oil pressure builds. That rattle is not an engine dying, but rather an engine giving notice that the tensioners need inspection or the guides may need replacement. An owner who understands that has time to plan and act, while an owner who ignores it does not. The CVTCS system, which varies intake camshaft timing continuously across the operating range, is the other item that rewards attention. The actuators are oil pressure dependent and sensitive to oil quality, meaning that extended change intervals or degraded oil will cause the actuators to stick. This presents as cam timing fault codes and a rough idle, but regular oil changes with the correct viscosity prevent that failure mode almost entirely. The VQ35DE is not a low-maintenance engine in the sense of being indifferent to care, as it rewards the owner who pays attention and punishes the one who doesn't. And sitting behind a 6-speed manual transmission in a luxury sedan, this engine became something specific. That combination of a naturally aspirated V6 with a real manual gearbox in a rear-wheel drive luxury car was unusual for a Japanese brand at that price point in 2003. It defined the G35's identity before the car ever turned a wheel in competition. The G35 sedan first appeared in North American showrooms in 2003 with a base price of roughly $26,900. At the time, the BMW 325i it was engineered to beat started at nearly $29,000, and that $3,000 gap was no accident of marketing. The yen-to-dollar exchange rate during the launch sat between 118 and 120 yen per dollar, which gave Nissan a massive financial lever to pull. This favorable math allowed a Japan-assembled car with a 3.5-liter V6 to undercut a German-assembled car with a smaller 2.5-liter engine by a significant margin. On paper, the value case for the Infiniti was almost unfair, but Nissan wasn't interested in winning on a low price alone, and the period-instrumented tests confirmed they didn't have to. When magazines like Car and Driver and Road and Track put the G35 Sport package through its paces, it pulled 0.87 g of lateral acceleration on the skid pad. That figure put it ahead of the 325i in identical testing conditions and made it competitive with the much more expensive 330i. Slalom speeds and braking distances followed the same pattern, proving that the car Nissan's engineers had benchmarked and measured themselves against was finally delivering the results they had promised. The interior, however, told a different story. Period reviews were remarkably consistent on this point, and they didn't pull any punches about the cabin quality. The G35's materials sat a full step below the BMW standard, the switchgear lacked a certain tactile precision, and the overall atmosphere didn't match the European car's sense of occasion. Those same reviewers were also quick to point out that the G35 costs less, noting that the gap in interior refinement tracked perfectly with the gap in the window sticker. It was a genuine weakness, but for buyers who prioritized how a car felt when the road turned, it wasn't a deal-breaker. Then, for the 2004 model year, Acura introduced the third-generation TL. The TL was also Japanese, also powered by a V6, and also priced to lure buyers away from BMW showrooms. It sold in massive numbers almost immediately, which was a level of competition Infiniti hadn't fully anticipated at that scale. Because the TL used a front-wheel drive layout, it could never truly match the G35's dynamic credentials or chassis balance on technical terms. But it did offer a quieter cabin, better standard equipment, and a more polished interior for roughly the same amount of money. For a buyer who wanted a Japanese luxury sedan without the European price tag, the TL was a very tempting answer. What the competition from Acura clarified was something that would define the G35's identity for the rest of its life. Rear-wheel drive was not just a feature the G35 happened to have. It was the entire reason the car existed in the first place. The specific feel of a balanced rear-drive chassis paired with a willing, naturally aspirated engine and a 6-speed manual was something no other Japanese competitor could replicate. They couldn't do it because they hadn't built a dedicated platform like the FM to deliver that exact sensation. The G35 found its audience, exceeded every sales projection Infiniti had set, and established itself as a real alternative to the legendary 3 Series. For 4 model years, this car represented the high watermark for the brand. Then the next generation arrived, and the philosophy behind the car began to shift. Something changed. The accountant era begins. The V36 generation arrived for the 2007 model year, and on the surface, it looked like a natural evolution of a successful formula. The platform still carried the FM designation, and the engine was still a member of the VQ family of naturally aspirated V6. Power actually went up to 306 horsepower, thanks to higher compression and revised valve timing in the new VQ35HR engine. If you simply read the spec sheet without looking for the subtext, the V36 looked like a straightforward improvement over the car it was replacing, but the road tests told a much more careful story. Period reviews consistently described the V36 as being more refined and composed at highway speeds than the original V35. It was quieter and better insulated from the road texture that the older car communicated directly through the steering wheel and the seat. In a conventional sense, these are real improvements that a broader group of buyers asks for in satisfaction surveys, but they came at a specific cost to the driving experience. What those same reviews noted, with varying degrees of disappointment, was that the V36 felt less distinctly sporty. The sharp edge that defined the V35's character, that sense of a car built for a specific dynamic target rather than a general luxury brief, had started to soften. The V36 was roughly 100 pounds heavier than its predecessor, and dimensionally larger in almost every direction. These weren't just cosmetic changes. They were engineering choices with handling consequences, and the reviews reflected that new reality. Then came the G37. The G37 nameplate replaced the G35 entirely and introduced the 3.7-liter VQ37 VHR, which produced a healthy 328 horsepower. The trajectory was consistent and deliberate, moving toward more displacement, more power, and more isolation from the outside world. And then, without much fanfare, the 6-speed manual disappeared from the sedan. The G37 Coupe kept the manual option for the enthusiasts, but the sedan did not. For a buyer who wanted a 3-pedal, rear-wheel drive luxury sedan from Infiniti, the options had suddenly narrowed to 0. The V35 had offered that specific combination for 4 straight years, yet no Infiniti sedan before it had a manual, and no Infiniti sedan since has offered one. That specific detail sounds like a minor grievance until you consider what a manual transmission actually represented in a car like this. The buyer who chose a manual in a luxury car in 2003 was sending a clear message to the manufacturer about what they valued. They wanted a physical connection to the machine, and they wanted to be an active part of what the engine and chassis were doing. The V35's manual option proved that Infiniti understood that desire, while the G37 sedan's deletion of the shifter suggested the conversation was over. The Q50 eventually completed this downward arc. Introduced for 2014, it brought Nissan's direct adaptive steering to the market, a steer-by-wire system that removed the physical connection between the driver and the front wheels. This electronic system generated documented complaints with the NHTSA and faced widespread criticism from owners who hated its artificial video game feel. Buyers who found the Q50's steering inadequate began specifically hunting for old V35 examples, not because they were newer or faster, but because they had a hydraulic rack with a mechanical soul that the new product had abandoned. Each new generation had stripped something away from the original formula. The V36 removed the raw edge, the G37 sedan removed the manual transmission, and the Q50 removed the steering feel entirely. None of these were accidents. They were cold calculations about what a mainstream buyer would tolerate and what an enthusiast would just have to accept. The V35 existed before those calculations became the rule, and that is exactly why it has survived them. The heart of the matter starts with the engine. While the VQ35DE found its home in the G35, it also powered a massive range of vehicles, including the 35OZ, the Altima, the Maxima, and even the Pathfinder and Frontier. This widespread use across the Nissan lineup created a massive advantage that only became clear 20 years later. Any mechanic in any town who has spent time under the hood of a Nissan or Infiniti knows this engine inside and out. Tasks like timing, chain service, diagnosing CVT, CS actuators, or replacing valve stem seals aren't mysterious jobs that require a specialized dealer or proprietary tools. These procedures are documented and understood by the entire industry, supported by a parts ecosystem that keeps repair bills manageable for independent shops. The 35OZ community essentially did the rest of the work, since the G35 and the Z33 350Z share the FM platform along with the engine, differential, and most of the suspension. Every breakthrough from the racing world flowed directly to G35 owners. Technical guides written for track-focused Z builds apply to the G35 with only minor tweaks, and engine rebuild steps transfer over perfectly. Aftermarket parts originally designed for the Z's competitive racing scene bolt right onto the G35 without a second thought. The G35 effectively inherited a massive technical support system it never had to build for itself, all because Nissan chose to share a platform rather than design two separate cars in isolation. We can see the difference when we look at the BMW E46, which was the car Infiniti used as its primary benchmark. The E46 is famous for a cooling system that tends to fail all at once, usually between 80 and 100,000 miles, when the water pump and expansion tank give up the ghost. When that happens, it is a catastrophic and expensive group of repairs that can sideline the car for weeks. By contrast, the VQ35DE has its own quirks like oil consumption or chain guide wear, but these issues are spread out over time rather than hitting the owner as a single massive bill. The maintenance is more of a steady rhythm than a sudden crisis, making it a much easier car to keep on the road. Then, we have the rarity of the manual sedan. Clean examples of the V35 sedan with a 6-speed manual now command a premium that seems to grow every single year. This specific configuration is a ghost in the Infiniti lineup because it didn't exist before this car and it hasn't been seen since. For a driver who wants that exact mix of luxury and mechanical engagement, there is no other option to consider. You either find a V35 from those specific production years with that specific gearbox, or you simply go without. The V35 didn't outlast its rivals by being a perfect machine, but rather because the things it did well were never truly replaced by something better. Instead, those features were simply removed. Conclusion: the V35 is more than just an old car sitting in a driveway. It is a physical piece of evidence. It proves that a company on the brink of financial ruin can sit down, write a German rival's name on a piece of paper, and decide to beat them at their own game. It is proof that a 52 to 48 weight distribution and a hydraulic steering rack could exist in a luxury sedan with a manual transmission. Nissan proved all of this was possible in a single car that made the equivalent BMW look overpriced. That specific combination of traits is gone now. The V36 that followed softened the edges of the driving experience, and the G37 sedan eventually dropped the manual transmission entirely. By the time the Q50 arrived, the mechanical steering feel had been replaced by a digital wire. Every new generation made a logical business decision to chase a wider audience, but each step took the car further away from what made the V35 special. If you happen to find a clean V35 manual sedan with a stack of service records, you need to understand what you are actually looking at. You aren't just buying a used vehicle, you are preserving a brief moment in time before the accountants took over the design room. The balance is still there, the hydraulic rack is still there, and that chain-driven V6 is still waiting for an owner who knows exactly what to listen for. They simply aren't building cars like this anymore. The window of opportunity that made this car a reality, the financial crisis, the corporate discipline, and the singular focus on a target, opened once and then closed very quietly. The V35 is the machine that made it through that window. If this story resonates, there is another one worth your time. The Mercedes W1-4 OS Class was built on the same lost philosophy. Perfection over profit, with a budget of over $1 billion to prove it. That video is up next.